Hi, I'm Jonathan Treussard, and welcome to Treussard Talks, where we talk about the mechanics of investing, the psychology of investing, and what it means to manage your wealth with purpose. Because understanding your wealth shouldn't be as complex as building it. Welcome to today's show. Joline Godfrey, in my estimation, you are a national treasure. I also happen to think of you as a friend, so I'm extraordinarily grateful that we're talking today. I feel like you're completely linked to my history as, let's just call it, a professional adult. As you and I were recalling when we were having lunch a couple of days ago, you literally were there the day I interviewed for my first job ever at a family office in New York, and much more in terms of our connections. But let's go back to the beginning. And as someone who has now dedicated a rather large portion of your life to educating the children of the wealthy, to helping families raise financially fit children, tell me how this all began.
Years ago, I was already doing financial education with children. I started with a focus on little girls because I had gotten it into my head that if somebody talked to little girls about money when they were little girls, the course of their lives would be different. I started really the first program for children, and it was girls only in the early days, called An Income of Her Own. Driving around with one of my friends who had a family office in those days in San Francisco, she said to me in a slightly uncomfortable tone of voice, "Joline, I don't really understand what it is you do, but I think my family needs it." And lo and behold, flash forward some months later, I took my team and my programming for financial education and worked with about 20 of the young people 18 and under in her family for a weekend in New York City. And as it happened, one of the Uber consultants for families of wealth was there, watched what we were doing, and boom, suddenly I went from kind of all kids to, in particular, families whose children had particular issues because they were growing up in abundance. It's important to note there is this universal fantasy of when I have a lot of money, life will be good. For the children of the wealthy, not so much all the time. And helping them gain confidence, navigate the culture, all of that is part of the process of financial education that we have been mastering over the last 2 or 3 decades.
Yeah, no, it really makes sense. And I think, your friend who had this instinct about it, right, even if she didn't know, I think the instinct was incredibly important. And to your point, I was part of a program that you put on in California back in 2008. And I was still a young man at the time, and I was surprised, but also enlightened by the experience that weekend, because I think it is a natural assumption that wealth makes things easier. Yeah. And it doesn't, because life is so multifaceted. And this, of course, was even more so perhaps because of the circumstances 2008 and the financial crisis was brewing. But I remember these teenagers being just extraordinarily angsty at, what this meant for their families, so on and so forth. So that makes a lot of sense. And you and I were talking recently about this. People just don't talk about money, and they don't talk about money no matter their circumstances, which makes the whole thing just even more of a mess. If you don't have a lot, then there is a shame associated with that situation. And God forbid you do have a lot, then it just makes the whole thing even more complex. So do you want to get into that?
It's fascinating. Shame operates at both ends of the economic spectrum. And, kids actually have a lot to share, but they're uncomfortable sharing, so they can't help one another, which is a little crazy. One of the things that we're trying to do at Bounce is develop what we think of as an expanded vision of wealth. I mean, historically, we all think about wealth as money. If you got a lot of money, you're wealthy. If you don't, you're not wealthy. That either or scenario, just actually, to your point, isn't real. It's far more multifaceted, far more complicated. So one of the things that we've been doing that I do think is accessible to any family, no matter where they are in the spectrum, is this notion of what we refer to as F.I.S.H. And I want to talk about that for a second because it is something you and your clients do, just naturally, intuitively, but I want to put some meat on the bones a little bit. So what I say to family is, look, you routinely meet with your trusted advisor at least 4 times a year to go over where your portfolio is. Are there dogs in that portfolio that you need to get rid of? Do you need to buy more of something? You just take that for granted. That's a healthy approach to managing your financial capital. But when it comes to your intellectual, social, and human capital, it feels more intuitive, abstract. You think, yeah, I'm doing that. I'm paying attention to my values. I'm doing that. But being able to translate that from the abstract to the concrete is very different when it comes to making it operational in the family. What we're trying to do at Bounce and with partners like you, obviously, and your clients, is turn the exploration of assets quarterly process into a bigger process so that what we're helping families do, and you've been doing for a long time, is really taking a quarterly look at your intellectual, social, and human capital too. And because that makes the acronym F.I.S.H, F-I-S-H, any 5-year-old can remember it. And so we start very early trying to help kids really absorb this notion of wealth being more than money. It's about your whole being. And in a family, it's about being intentional about the wholeness of your family in this intellectual, social, and human capital way. So that's a long-winded response, Jonathan, but I know that it's something you and your clients talk about. We've just tried to package it in a way they can package it for their kids.
I think that's, there's so much there. As an economist, of course, I know intellectually that wealth is more than money. We talk about human capital in a narrow sense, but it tries to capture the fact that your being, the thing that doesn't have the dollar figure associated with it, has value. I actually think reviewing performance is fine. Now, it can actually lead to, kind of unintended consequences. But much more than the direction of travel, sometimes it's helpful to review the stock of these different dimensions of wealth, right? How are you doing with your friends? How are you doing health-wise? How are you doing with your intellectual stimulation? I was just driving back from LA with a friend a couple of days ago who says, I love Orange County. I never want to live anywhere else, but I need to go to LA once a month just to get a fix. And so it's like, are you giving yourself what you need? And as we talk about this performance review process, obviously, there's volatility in the stock market. We just had a little bit of it, right? But there is volatility in all these other dimensions. And if you just found out that, one of your parents is dealing with a serious health issue, that needs to be acknowledged. It's just part of the picture that otherwise we're just not having the same experience of this conversation.
Right.
So I love to talk about kind of the duality of mechanics and psychology, because some of the things require hard knowledge, hard skills, and that's what I think you're trying to do with Bounce 10, which is to create a process, kind of leveraging the mechanics of understanding wealth in its broader sense. But let me, also invite you to talk about the psychology of it all. How do people go about dealing with this very complex conversation, this abstract thing, wealth?
Well, historically, I think it's common knowledge families are even more ready to talk about sex than money still at this stage, which is a little crazy given that we're immersed in money. And yet helping people grab their language and their confidence, because it is partly about the attitudes the family nurtures in you as you're growing up. This question of how do I feel about my wealth or my lack of wealth or my place on the spectrum, or do I have more or less, or how are my kids doing? those are all feelings that tie into how we're willing to talk about money. It turns out children are actually ready to talk about money about a decade before their parents. So parents who are looking at their 12-year-old and they're thinking, oh, they're too young, it's not time, they can't understand. No, actually, they're understanding from the first time they get into a big grocery store. They understand the first time a parent comes home and forgets to bring a gift when they come home from that trip. And they are very canny as little ones at knowing how to make their parents feel guilty about walking in the door without something. So when families put off these conversations, what they're putting off is practice. And I think about this comfort level in the family with dealing with abundance or lack of abundance, whatever the case is. It's about practice. We think it's about knowledge. It's not. It is about that combination, as you're putting it, of mechanics and psychology, of reality, of real numbers with your feelings about those real numbers. And if you can give children practice early on in a way that in which the stakes are very low, then it's going to be much easier later. And one of the biggest ways this shows up, and I know you've seen this, is in the world of the prenup conversation. All too many families actually have not had much of a conversation amongst themselves about money until it's like, oh my God, they're getting married and nobody's talked about what this means. And suddenly it's a legal issue, it's a financial issue. No one is prepared because they have not talked about the values, the psychology, the feelings. If you're doing that from the time the kid is 2 to the moment where they are signing documents or not, it is a whole other issue because it's just part of the normal piece of your life. It's part of the culture of the family. That's the difference.
I think, again, the idea of time on task, right? If you're not helping your kids get their heads around these things, my kids are 13, and we've been on this journey of empowering them to have these complex understandings of the world for a long time. And, using your example of a prenup, the world is complicated. It can be about love and it can be about money. And, if you wait, then you create these kind of binary conversations. Well, I thought this was about the person I love, and now you're telling me it's about this other thing. And you're like, it was not either or.
Right.
And I think that's really important. When I think about what I want my children to kind of walk into the adult world with, I think this understanding that the world is complex, that the world is multifaceted, and that, you have to kind of walk and chew gum. You have to be able to be confused and not get angry about it, because angry is not going to resolve anything. Confusion is natural, and I think that's really important. And the other part of it is modeling. Every day is an opportunity to model. So how do you think about modeling in your framework?
Well, I think that's such an important piece. And in fairness, in my work with families, I knew that was real, but I didn't focus on that until the last few years, really. And I talk about it in terms of, for years, I have focused on financial education for children. What I missed was the financial parenting part. What's exciting for me these days is that having shifted my own consciousness to not just one or the other, but back to both, what I see is that teaching parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, by the way, to model their financial values, to model their behavior is a huge piece of the process that we now are putting a whole lot of attention into in a much more successful way. It's funny. I remember years ago giving a talk at the Harvard Business School, and it's always an incredibly energetic place to give a talk, particularly to the alumni, because they're in it with their own kids and they're really struggling. One dad far at the back of the room raised his hand and he said, "Look, I've got a yacht. Do I have to give up my yacht in order to teach this kid about values?" And, that's one of the real issues families face. Do I have to stop flying on my private jet? Do I have to stop taking my kid out on the yacht? No, but you have to be pretty intentional about how you introduce it, how you use it, how you think about it and talk about it. It's not just that I've got a lot of money, I can do whatever the heck I want. And we know this because we're watching people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and families at that level all struggle with, okay, how exactly do I do this in a way that doesn't raise kids who are either overcome by anxiety, lacking confidence, or simply do not have the skills to function in a self-reliant way. So these are big issues without easy, quick answers that unfold over time, and the solutions unfold over time, like compound interest in a good stock portfolio.
Yeah, and it's about it being intentional, right? Using your yacht example, or just, having fancy cars and fancy homes and, every part of this, to just lean into it without a framework. It just leaves the kid thinking, okay, are we yacht people? Like, what does that mean? And then, of course, if you pretend you were this dad in the back of the room at HBS and you said, okay, I am giving up the yacht and I'm going to be driving a Honda Accord. Like, that seems unhealthy because now we're just denying reality. Never mind the fact that you're denying your right to derive enjoyment out of the wealth you have. But, the modeling thing, and I would be equally worried about the person who's hiding the financial reality, is because I think the kids, to your point, the kids are picking up on it. And again, if you have a parent who's dealing with loss of a job, or a parent who's dealing with, and you're walking around being like, dad's going to the office today, that gaslighting isn't helpful. And so
Right.
the wealth gaslighting is not helpful either.
I think that is such a brilliant, important thing to say. If you don't talk to your kids about money, you are in fact gaslighting them. I've not heard anybody say it that way before, Jonathan, but that's what's going on. And so we wonder then why kids are anxious. Well, they're anxious because they see reality and they're trying to deal with it. And over here, somebody's saying, oh, no, honey, that's not real, honestly. Now, if you really genuinely do not have enough money in your bank account to buy something this kid wants, that kid knows you're dealing truthfully when you say, honey, we can't afford it. The kid who hears that but knows it's not true is now feeling as though they can't trust themselves on a whole lot of scales. That is a disservice to do to children in a very big way. You remind me of a book that I haven't heard talked about in a while, but I still count as one of the most important out there. It's called The Power of Half, and it's written by a father-daughter team. The 14-year-old daughter came home, her dad picked her up from private school one day. They stopped at a stop sign. On one side of the car is a homeless guy with his, pail out. On the other is a guy driving a Mercedes. The daughter says to her father, if the guy in the Mercedes would just sell that car, he could put money over here to the homeless guy. The father, of course, understood it's a little more complicated than that, but here he is in the car with 15 minutes, and he does not know, how am I going to give this kid a big economics lesson? I mean, hell, you've spent your entire life, Jonathan, as an expert economist. He's trying to figure out how to do this in a few minutes with his 14-year-old. They get home. This conversation continues. The mother, at some point over dinner that night, says to her daughter, in an exasperated way, what do you want us to do? Sell the house and give everything away? The daughter says, yes. What ensues from that conversation is a killer story, real story, what this real family did. But I think, and I recommend it, it's called The Power of Half, Kevin Sullivan, look it up. It speaks to how complicated these issues are and how well-intentioned parents often are without the tools to know what to do in the middle of a very complicated situation for their children. I'm going to take away this gaslighting notion from this conversation, Jonathan, because that's exactly what goes on in families, and they don't understand how much damage they're doing to their children. It's fascinating.
Thanks for listening. I'm Jonathan Treussard, founder of Treussard Capital Management. I hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to start receiving my free newsletter, Wealth Empowered, or if you'd like to learn more about me and Treussard Capital Management, go to Treussard.com. That's TREUSSARD.com. Thanks, and enjoy the rest of the episode. I mean, this story you recount about the Mercedes versus the homeless guy. I mean, I feel it in my own version, in our own version of parenting, which is you are facing all these dilemmas all day long as to how to, answer things as they kind of play out, right? And it's, again, I'll tell you a personal story, which to me was a non-negotiable moment of authenticity and normalizing just the things that happen in life. Because I think the challenge, particularly in a world where we think money solves a lot of problems, well, it might solve a lot of problems, but it doesn't solve all the problems, right? So you have to just accept that things happen. Before I started my firm, I was let go. I was laid off, and I came home, and we weren't not going to tell the kids, right?
Right.
And the kids had questions. The kids wanted to know, well, what does this mean for our finances, and all of that type of line of inquiry. And it was important for them to be kind of steeped into reality. It was a messy middle. We weren't going to be destitute, but yes, did it mean that income was going to be lower for a period of time? Yes. And then the other part of it is the psychological thing. One of my daughters said to me, "Are you going to be sad, Dad?" First of all, I'm immensely grateful that, we have the ability to talk about these things. And then it gave me an opportunity to model that in the midst of change and of uncertainty, I said, no, and just you watch. That's a value. Resilience is a value. How do you have the lean into value conversation with parents and kids?
It's core to one of our foundational issues. We do what we call values mapping with families, because we know what's so interesting about the story you just told is there are the families who have aspirational values. We want to be open with our kids and share everything with them. And then they have the actual real values. Yeah, but we really, really want to protect them. And so we're not going to have a fully open conversation. Instead, we'll gaslight. But somewhere between the aspirational values and the actual real played out values is the life of the family. And so our job, it seems to me, yours and mine, is to help families understand the gap between their aspirational and their real values and how to bridge those two places. And we've found that this values map exercise we do is a way to bring to the front just how wide that gap is. And even in one family, the gap between aspiration and reality for mom may be different for dad, may be different from grandma. And if those family members can't be acknowledging of the gaps and how they're going to bring them together, that is fertile ground for financial conflict. I mean, people always talk about fights over money. There are no fights over money. There are fights over values about money. And when you can sort of untangle that and begin to hear one another in terms of your priorities and your real and aspirational values and what keeps you from realizing the aspirational, if you will, that is much harder work than most families, frankly, want to sign up for. But those families do have a much better family experience. It's pretty simple.
I mean, the point about aspirational values versus where you actually live, it's fabulous because my suspicion, as a mathematical economist, I'm going to use the word asymptotic. You're never going to be at the destination, right? So it's a journey. If you're lucky and you're intentional, you're going to close the gap somewhat at the margin. And then, by the way, sometimes you're going to mess up and the gap is going to widen, right? So it's, all of that gives you something to work on. And that's great because the whole we did it. Congratulations. That's a complete fallacy. You're describing it, of course, in the context of family dynamics. But I'm reminded of the work that I did with Katie Sherrod when she was CEO at Research Affiliates, and I worked for her directly. And we did a lot of work on corporate culture. And you know what's worse than like the company that doesn't have values and a mission and a vision statement is the company that does, but lives in a completely different way. You know, we welcome feedback from all, but God forbid the junior director comes to the CEO and says, you know, and of course there's a repercussion for that, for stepping out of line. And I was telling you a personal story the other day about how hard that is to do to achieve a healthy culture. I was telling you about my experience working for, you know, extraordinarily wealthy people when I was still in my late 20s and not being authentic in my own behavior because it was hard to believe, despite everybody's best efforts, that you actually wanted to hear from me. You know, It's like, surely you're saying it, but do you really want me to do it? And, you know, so you have to be very intentional to actually create trust or create belief. And again, as I think about it, you know, in the context of the family, you know, trust is this currency that, you know, and I think to just say, as you're saying, hey, we've got these aspirations, and we're going to try to close the gap. But by the way, call us out. I love when my kids kind of call me out, right? When they're like, hey, that wasn't great. And I'm like, yeah, that wasn't great. So that, I think that's a lifelong journey. So you started, as you described, you know, working very hands-on, one-on-one in these highly bespoke experiences.
It's immersive education, really.
Immersive education. And so now you're trying to create a more leverageable version of that through Bounce 10. Do you want to tell me about that a little bit?
I really was so frustrated about how little impact I could make as my career went on. I could see that there was X number of families I could get to, and that was it. And meanwhile, many families, every family, I would argue, really could benefit from starting early with their kids and having engaging ways to bring them into financial fluency. But I couldn't figure out how to figure out the instruments and raise the capital and put those things together, one family at a time. So today, finally, we've cracked the nut and we are scaling immersive financial education with a focus on very young children and financial parenting, making tools for families. It has 3 parts. We refer to it as the journey. That is, this is not a class. It's not a sermon. It's not something that happens in a few months. It is a lifelong journey, to echo you. There is a community, and for the community, we have a parenting portal that has master classes and content and a library and experts and a grandparents hour and all kinds of cool, juicy things that are resources for families. And then we have the third part, which we refer to as the box, which is filled with analog, playful activities for children between 4 and 10, or littles and bigs, as we call them, because there are 4 to 6-year-olds and 7 to 10-year-olds. We make this whole package available to families, family offices, multifamily offices, and in this way, we're able to more effectively impact family culture on a bigger scale than I've ever been able to do. So for me right now, it is a very exciting, busy period of life, taking what we have learned collectively, and I mean the likes of me and you and other professionals out there. We've learned a lot about what families need to thrive and to be resilient, to use another of your words. Now what I'm doing is really just pulling it all together so it's much easier to use. So cool period of time. And, you know, this podcast, of course, is just one of the mechanisms we have to share some of that with families.
I love that. I think that's really important. I'm going to ask you for some version of a freebie, okay? Because I've seen so much of this where I meet someone who's on the cusp of wealth. Maybe it's inheritance. Maybe it's, you know, the kind of the family resources being made available. Maybe it's, you know, some version of, hey, you've been working at a startup and guess what? You know, it turned out it was a real thing. And I meet people that are basically in a state of panic, of deep anxiety about the meaning of this wealth that they're about to become, that are about to become theirs. Because again, I was about to use the word stewards, but as you and I know, I think the word steward of wealth is fraught. What do you tell someone who's just anxious about the fact that wealth is about to become theirs?
Such a great question, Jonathan, because that, in spite of the volatility of the world right now, that still is a real thing. What I say, honestly, the first time I meet a family that comes with that very scenario, I will say, let's just breathe. We've got a little time here. We can make this happen. I think there is this sense of life barreling at you with this monster change, and you feel like the truck is going to run you over before you can figure out how to put a stop sign up. And what I usually say is, if you just breathe, it's like stepping aside from the truck and knowing it'll go by. We have some things we can do here. And then we begin what I think I just referred to as the foundational work. And I don't care if you don't have any children yet, or you have adult children or grandchildren, whatever. I think families who can get some help to do foundational work, and that is where am I on my own knowledge level? What do I know? What do I need to know? What is my F.I.S.H inventory? What are my intellectual, social, and human capital assets in addition to my financial assets? And what's my values map in the family? And once I get that early data, then we can take a look at all of that, then figure out, okay, where do we go from here? It's not rocket science. It's not simple. It's not black and white. It takes some investment and it takes real time. So if you're not intentional, don't even bother starting. You'll just screw it up. But if you're intentional about it, I think that idea of kind of like adopting a second or third language. When I was starting in on French, it was Je m'appelle Joline. My name is. You start at the very first sentence and you build and you get to paragraphs and you get to whole long conversations and then you get to thinking. And that is what it takes to become financially adept and fluent in a family, and to do that while you're learning to be resilient and to thrive. It's a process, a journey, to use your word. But honestly, what else is family? I think there is so much talk that people put family in their head and an image is in there. I like to expand that image of what does family look like? How creative can you be about what it looks like, what the dynamics are, what the possibilities are? Just blow it out. It can be a pretty juicy, exciting experience, but it does take some commitment.
As I think about your framework, F.I.S.H, and I think about things that people say, and some common phrases have relevance. People say, what do you get the person who has everything? And right. I it's a hard question, right? We've all been there where you're like, with that person, if they have the yacht and what can they get, right? And as I remember sharing a story with someone who has everything about the person their father was to somebody else, and the positive impact that their father had, leading to the healthy birth of a child, and that child becoming my friend's spouse. And that's what you give to someone who has everything, is recognition that their being, their lives go well beyond the dollar signs, right? And I guess that's, as I keep thinking about the way you approach it, that's what I go back to, which is all of a sudden, things that you think are impossible, like having, really giving someone a gift, but to say, let me tell you what your father did that changed another person's trajectory forever. And I guess what I would say to the person who's about to embark on a journey of wealth of their own is remember that, because the money thing will still just remain one lane, right?
Right. Boy, that's so true. Yeah.
So you just brought up French, so now you're in trouble. Maybe we should have had this whole conversation in French, but we're going to close. I like to conclude my conversations with a questionnaire that Bernard Pivot asked on French TV at the end of every episode. And James Lipton did the same, adapted the questions for the Actor Studio. So this is without preparation, Joline. So please feel free to take a second.
Okay.
But I have a series of questions for you.
Oh, man. Yes.
What is your favorite word?
Possibility.
What is your least favorite word?
No.
What is your favorite drug?
Oh, the smell of neroli. I live in a place where in April, the orange blossoms just burst. And I walk out on the porch and the smell of neroli and jasmine is mind-blowing, literally. That's my favorite.
I love it. What sound or noise do you love?
Oh, running water. Running water. I grew up with a family who had a cottage on a lake, and the sound of that lake, the sound of rippling water. I have running water wherever possible because it just brings everything right to a Zen state.
Levels you out. Yeah, that's right. What sound or noise do you hate?
Cacophony, loud noises, lots of loud noises. I hate being at a dinner where I expect to talk to people and you can't have a conversation because there's just too much going on. So if you're coming to dinner at my house, you should be prepared for me to rap on a glass and ask people to tell stories because I hate having many voices talk at once. It's counterproductive.
What is your favorite curse word?
Oh, fuck.
It's a classic. Who would you like to see on a new banknote?
Oh, Lordy. So many possibilities. Well, I'd put my friend Gloria Steinem on there in a heartbeat. But she should be on a social justice note somewhere. I think for a woman who has made a difference economically or financially in the world, Frances Perkins is somebody I would put on that list. She's a Maine girl like me who worked for FDR, of course, and she invented the idea of the social safety net. I think that's an important idea, and I want Frances Perkins to get more traction or more recognition for that.
I love it. Well, the lobbying starts today. That's good. What profession other than your own would you not want to attempt?
Well, it's funny. I'm very ambivalent. I'm deeply jealous of your genius as a mathematician. And I've worked with enough engineers and thinkers to know how powerful the language of math is. It is not my gift. And so I wouldn't want to try it because I wouldn't succeed. But I also envy those of you for whom it's in the bones.
Math is cool, but that's okay. If you came back in another life as a plant or an animal, what would it be?
Oh, wow. That's a great one. I think I'd come back as a plant. And the people who know me know I have two lives, part-time living in Maine and part-time living in California, which are two planets, really. And so part of the year I'd come back as a cactus, and the rest of the year I'd come back as a pine tree. And in that way, my whole self would be together again.
Wonderful. Are you ready for the last one?
Yeah, I welcome the last one.
If heaven exists, What would you like to hear Gott say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Oh my, you came too early.
Come back in a while.
Come back in a while. I say that in part in jest, and yet here I am at an unusual stage of life doing a startup. I have a tremendous amount of energy, and I do wish I had another 50 years to do 3 or 4 more startups. So, I haven't run out of steam yet, but I know I will eventually. So, yeah, I'd like more time, but we all would. So that's it, I guess.
Well, I'm incredibly grateful for the time you gave us today. As I said, I really think of you as a treasure, a national treasure, a personal treasure, as a friend. And I'm just so grateful that we could talk today. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thanks, Jonathan.
This podcast is for entertainment and education only. Nothing here is financial advice. Treussard Capital Management is a registered investment advisor. Please visit our website, www.treussard.com, for additional information and disclaimers.